Rediscover God's Word, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. This is Real Bible Study with teacher Tom Bradford. Welcome to Torah class.
In our study of the book of Obadiah, we left off at verses 12 through 14, which lists 8 things that Edom ought not to have done in retrospect and ought not do as regards their relationship with Israel. Now, it's always my goal and hope to be able to make God's word not just understandable, but also relatable to you. That is too much, I'm afraid. The Bible characters and the words they say and the choices they made can seem so distant and out of touch with us that they remain kind of vaporous, almost mythological in status to us. We can't identify with them. And it seems as though these folks are so extraordinary or one of a kind that it is a hopeless endeavor to try to make them totally real and human, let alone role models. Or, on the other end of the scale, having a character we ought to do our best not to adopt. But real and human they were. Their thoughts, their lives had the same sort of concerns that we all face. They had preferences, prejudices, weaknesses, strengths, failures, and successes, good days and bad. Men had arguments with their wives. Children didn't always obey. It was the same for the nations. Some had good leaders, others poor ones. And of course, their condition didn't remain static. The effectiveness and dedication of their leadership vacillated over time. And these nations had eras of prosperity and scarcity, times of peace, times of war, social discontent. It was no different for Edom, which is the main subject of Obadiah. Edom was not always an enemy of Israel. But in the sense of their legal, technical relationship with YHWH, God of Israel, they were entirely opposite that of Israel. God separated a people for himself away from all other people and nations of the world in order that they might serve him and that his purposes would be brought about through them. It began with Abraham. God made a covenant with Abraham, and so Abraham and his family became the first humans that we could call God's covenant people. Abraham had children, and of those several children, God chose Isaac to be the line of Abraham's descendants that would carry on the benefits and the obligations of the covenant God made with Abraham. Isaac had children, and the chosen from among them to carry on the covenant line of people was Jacob. Now, what is significant, what is pertinent to Obadiah is that Jacob's twin brother, Esau, was not included in that line of covenant people. I'm going to say this another way. Esau was destined to live outside of the covenant that God made with Abraham. But Jacob, Abraham's grandson, inherited the covenant. And later on, Jacob obtained the alternative name of Israel, and he went on to found the nation of Israel. Esau went on to found the nation of Edom. Therefore, even though the descendants of the two brothers, Israel and Edom, didn't necessarily war with each other, they were usually not on friendly terms. And the underlying reason, get this. The underlying reason for this never-ending friction all had to do with the matter of the covenant. Now, one of several of Jehovah's intrinsic attributes is that he is not a God who unites. Rather, he divides, elects, and separates. He divided the twin boys into two distinct groups with different destinies. He elected Jacob to carry on the covenant line. He then separated the two from one another. God is indeed a God of love, but that does not make him a compromiser. Nor does he act in a way we might say is even-handed. Lines are drawn. Evil and good are defined. Choices are made. Duties and roles are assigned. And then boundaries between all of these things are created. And except where he has made a way for one side to cross over to the other, no mixing of his separated choices is allowed. For example, generally speaking, Edom and Israel were not to mix, including a prohibition of no marriage between the two groups. From a higher level, in order to understand this command not to mix, is that those who are in covenant with God are not to mix themselves with those who are not in covenant with him. So, what are those who want to worship Israel's God and become part of that covenant people to do? God made a way for that to happen. And Ruth was one of the best examples of how this can occur. Ruth, a non-Israelite, crossed over by declaration and vow to her mother-in-law, who was an Israelite. Ruth 1, 16 through 17. But Ruth said, "Don't press me to leave you and stop following you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Adonai bring terrible curses on me, and worse ones as well, if anything but death separates you and me." Upon the advent of Yeshua, a declaration and a vow are the necessary way to cross over. Paul used the well-known metaphor of being grafted in and the customary imagery of Israel as the olive tree to explain this means of crossing over from a non-covenant people to the covenant people. In Romans 11, starting at verse 13. "However, to those of you who are Gentiles, I say this, since I myself am an emissary to the Gentiles, I make known the importance of my work in the hope that somehow I may provoke some of my own people to jealousy and save some of them. For if their casting Yeshua aside means reconciliation for the world, what will their accepting him mean? It'll be life from the dead. Now, if the challah offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole loaf. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, Gentiles, a wild olive, were grafted in among them and have become equal sharers in the rich root of this olive tree, don't boast as if you were better than the branches. However, if you do boast, remember that you are not supporting the root supporting you. So you'll say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True, but so what? They were broken off because of their lack of trust. However, you keep your place only because of your trust. So don't be arrogant. On the contrary, be terrified, for if God didn't spare the natural branches, he certainly won't spare you. So how is it that a non-covenant people, Gentiles, can join, be grafted into the covenant people, Israel? A declaration of trust in and a vow to the God of Israel. And since Messiah Yeshua's advent, this trust revolves around trust in Yeshua as God's Messiah, as the one who has made the way for us to become part of the covenant, of all of God's covenants, with all their blessings and their obligations by means of becoming part of the covenant people. Now, this matter of covenant is at the crux of what Obadiah instructs us. There are entirely different fates that await those in covenant with God versus those who are not. In Obadiah, Israel represents the fate of those of covenant with God. Edom, the fate of those who are not. Therefore, if you believe and you trust in the God of Israel and his son Yeshua, Obadiah is about as pertinent to our personal faith as it gets. And with that understanding now, let's look more closely at Obadiah verses 12 through 14, which states what non-covenant people ought not to do to the covenant people, Israel. Or in modern terms, what Jordan and all Gentile nations ought not to do to the nation of Israel. Obadiah 1, 12 through 14. You shouldn't gloat over your kinsmen on their day of disaster or rejoiced over the people of Judah on their day of destruction. You shouldn't have spoken arrogantly on a day of trouble or entered the gate of my people on their day of calamity. No, you shouldn't have gloated over their suffering on their day of calamity or laid hands on their treasure on their day of calamity. You shouldn't have stood at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives or handed over their survivors on a day of trouble. In the early 6th century BC, when Babylon invaded Judah and Edom aided Babylon, apparently Edom did all these things to Israel. Notice, nothing here suggests that Edom actually took up arms and joined the attack. And while that's not to say that Edom never attacked Israel, nor will they in the future, nor that somehow them directly attacking Israel's kind of okay because it's not specifically mentioned among these 8 don'ts. In the scenario Obadiah is witness to, Edom is acting as an ally to Babylon, but also as a nation that takes joy in Israel's pain and troubles. Now, in his prophecy, one would have to say that Obadiah's report is one of horror about what he has been shown in his vision. So Obadiah is being placed in the position of being present as Babylon attacked Israel, and he watched Edom help them. And then he projects what they're doing into the future when they will do these same dastardly things again. So the message to Edom is more or less, you shouldn't have done these things. Stop doing these things. Don't ever do these things again. But prophecy informs us Edom won't stop, and they will do them again against Israel in the future. You know, as a brief editorial, it's important for us to grasp how the church in general looked at this prophecy and similar ones, and why so much of the church never took them seriously. Simply it is that Israel ceased to exist as a nation in 70 AD. Not until the mid-20th century in modern times did it exist again. So for nearly 2,000 years, there was no Israel. No sign it would ever return as a nation. So no thought about Israel or the prophecies concerning them. None of this was relevant at all to the church. So once a way of thinking and a number of foundational doctrines are created about something, they are very hard to rethink and change. So the Christian community really didn't pay a lot of attention to the amazing, impossible moment when Israel was reborn in a day, as prophesied, as a nation of Jews in 1948. And any of even the remotest thought about Israel had long ago left the church. Certainly, some newer denominations that sprang up in the second half of the 20th century have noticed Israel's rebirth, but the main attraction for them is that this is all about the end time stuff, like Armageddon and the rapture and the return of Jesus, but with Israel not really playing much of a role other than as caretakers of the Holy Land. For other denominations, the reactions are varied. Some deny that Israel's rebirth has any biblical application, that his return is more of a clever, self-fulfilling prophecy propagated by a few wealthy Jews. And in some ways, this rebirth is actually illegitimate. Others see it as an interesting place to visit. But otherwise, its existence and purposes don't show up on that denomination's radar. Bottom line, it takes interest in the Old Testament to understand the central place God has for Israel in the end times and beyond. But if one believes that the Old Testament is antiquated and no longer relevant for Christ followers, then there's no value in studying Obadiah or in taking anything about it seriously. Taking this position is quite problematic because several branches of the church are finding themselves in a position that they aren't sure whether they want to or ought to support the Israelis or the Palestinians in the Gaza war that is going on as I write this piece. And be that as it may, as regards Israel, Obadiah makes it clear what no one is to do towards them. When verse 12 is brought across from the Hebrew literally, it says something like, "But do not gaze upon the day of your brother." Now, the Hebrew Bible is full of expressions, and we encounter one of the dozens of them right here. To gaze upon someone means to stand back and look with interested pleasure. Remember about David? What did he do about Bathsheba? He gazed at her. And the strength of the indictment against Edom lies in the word achi, which means brother. Edom is literally a brother nation to Israel. Thus, it is aberrant to a level that is difficult to measure that Jacob's own brother would watch with joy as Jacob was decimated. And since the term the day is nearly always associated with wrath and destruction in the Bible, then the day of your brother means a time of your brother's ruin. Edom is told that they should not have openly rejoiced over Israel's destruction. This means the leaders and the people of Edom celebrated Babylon's decimation of Judah. In modern times, we find that Jordan, Edom, along with other Arab nations, literally held wildly happy street celebrations attended by scores of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, over the murder, rape, and kidnapping of more than 1,200 Israelis by Hamas on October 7th, 2023. These people may have gazed with a scornful pleasure upon Israel's troubles, but I guarantee you they also did not escape the Father's gaze upon them that was with anything but pleasure. And whether this was the final end times occasion that this will happen or there is yet another is an open question. But I don't think that this was the final occasion just yet. Now the third don't do it of verse 12 is, Edom ought not to have spoken arrogantly on a day of trouble for Israel. Now, interestingly, yet another Hebrew expression is used here. Literally, this reads, and do not open your mouth wide. This is an idiom that means to throw back your head and howl with laughter. There's an element of scornful mockery involved. We also witnessed this recently with Edom, Jordan, and other Arab nations over the barbarian attack by Hamas upon Israel. Where we read in the complete Jewish Bible, on a day of trouble, it is certainly correct as a thought translation of the Hebrew, although it's not literal. And I like to look at the literal because it can offer a little more nuanced understanding of what is said. What it says literally is, on the day of narrow. Here's a brief Hebrew lesson. The Hebrew word is tzara. And while it literally means narrow, in Hebrew idiom form, narrow means something that is squeezed down or hard pressed. In the context of a disaster, this expands further to mean something like dire straits. So to say this means trouble certainly gets the general idea across, but not perfectly. Here's the thing. When it comes to translating the Bible, the Old Testament uses barely more than 9,000 unique Hebrew vocabulary words. I'm sure that's not the total number of Hebrew words that existed in the Hebrew vocabulary. Likely, though, there's not too many more. That might sound like a large number. But consider this. When over 100 years ago, the Oxford English Dictionary was first created, there were over 400,000 unique English words in it. So it's not hard to see that the same Hebrew word necessarily must, in many instances, be used to mean a few very different things. And there is a wide variety of English words that could be chosen to translate a single Hebrew word. But which is the one that best captures the meaning? The reality is that we simply do not know the full range of all those possible things those words could have meant 2,500 and more years ago. But in recent times, we are finally realizing that the Bible is just overflowing with idioms and expressions that makes some of the sort of strange things we read in the Bible suspect as not literal. But it also makes the Bible translation even more challenging. Obadiah is especially full of expressions, as well as consisting mostly of poetry. So that's why this book is so technically difficult to decipher. The next accusation against Edom is that they entered the gate singular, of God's people in the day of their disaster. That is, whereas we typically have a plural word used for entering Jerusalem, gates, here we don't. And while it's conjecture, I think there is validity to the idea that whereas most commentators assume this is talking about the gates into Jerusalem, in reality it's not. The idea behind this verse is buried a little under its words. Probably this is talking about the many small towns and villages scattered throughout Judea, most of which had neither walls nor gates. Rather, gates, it just means an entry point. That's really all it means. The crux of this verse is not that Edom followed the Babylonian soldiers through the city gates of Jerusalem to loot and pillage, but rather that they went after the smaller towns that didn't have the same ability to resist them as did Jerusalem, towns that Babylon didn't have much interest in anyway. Typically, only local residents and invited guests entered into a guard-gated city. Why would Babylon enter in the first place? No doubt to loot, just as we're told later. So again, Israel was in a bad way, and a nation that ought to be a brother to them instead conspired with the enemy to do harm to them. In verse 13, we again hear of Edom gloating over Judah's calamity. In verse 14, it is that Edom should not have stood at the crossroads to cut down the fugitives. The Hebrew is a little hard to decipher. Could be speaking about Edom standing at a breach in a city wall or even at the mouth of a narrow pass into the mountains. But something like escape route. This is the sense of it. So the idea is the Edomites, no doubt in a pre-planned maneuver, stationed themselves at the most likely places that the residents of Judah would try to escape from the Babylonian invaders. And there Edom would intercept, capture them, possibly to turn them over to Babylon. I mean, what a stunning betrayal. It's not just that Edom was a brother nation, it's that the Judahites were God's covenant people, and Edom was completely aware of it. There's also another possibility. It shouldn't go unnoticed that in Amos chapter 1, Edom is spoken of as being involved in the human trafficking trade. It is said that Philistia and Tyre would hand over entire populations of people to Edom, who likely paid for them at wholesale prices. According to 2 Chronicles 28, Edom actually raided Judah and captured people. But for what purposes? To increase their own population? Not likely. So what I am saying is that rather than Edom working in concert with Babylon to capture fleeing Judahites, giving them to Babylon, they used this opportune situation to capture these fleeing Judahites to keep for themselves and then use them in the slave trade. Now, essentially, this is kidnapping that uses those taken in exchange for money. The effect is the same compared to Hamas kidnapping close to 300 Israelis, holding them as bargaining chips. And no matter how far astray Israel and many Israelis have gone, they're still God's people. And for Hamas or anyone to do such a thing to them is to play with divine fire. To support Hamas's actions makes those leaders and their nations and those faith groups equally culpable. Moving on to verse 15. The matter of what Edom did to Israel is explained in terms of what is going to happen to them in return. Everything that Edom did will now happen to them. It is better to rearrange verse 15 so that the order that is no doubt intended is more clear. Whereas it says right now, for the day of Adonai is near for all nations. As you did, it will be done to you. Your dealings will come back on your own head. It's more clear this way. Just as you have done, it'll be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head, for the day of YHWH is near against all the nations. It just gets it in the right order and rhythm to do that. So the idea is that Edom will suffer its consequences for dealing with God's covenant people. And it will happen in connection. It will happen in connection with the event of the day of the Lord against all the nations of the world. And several prophets make it clear that God's wrath against the nation is an end times event. Therefore, I'd like you to please hear this. You and your family's well-being might well depend on it. You and I, we live in those nations that are prophesied for destruction. That believers live in these nations. Even believers that support Israel and stand against their enemies, that does not change things. This is the nature of national and communal judgments. Our status as believers has to do with our individual salvation and relationship with God, which is a different issue than what happens to the nation or group we're a part of. The thing is this, the ancient prophecies don't nuance the destruction and evil that will happen to the nations of the world the way the New Testament does. The New Testament divides the mayhem and catastrophes that are coming into two categories: tribulation and wrath. Tribulation is a result of man's evil against other men. For example, what Hitler did was man's evil against other men. It wasn't God's wrath. On the other hand, what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah was not man's evil against other men, but rather the destruction was due to God's wrath. Believers, we will definitely be around in the end times to suffer from tribulation, no matter what nation we're a part of, no matter how devout of believers we are in Yeshua. However, the purpose of the rapture is so that the same devout believers will not suffer God's wrath. Thus, as we follow the 21 judgments of Revelation, what we notice is that the first several judgments are all the result of tribulation. Starting with the sixth seal judgment, however, it is God's wrath that begins to be poured out. So whatever exactly the rapture is, it seems that it happens before then. What is interesting is that while the nations will suffer God's wrath, Israel won't. In fact, his wrath is largely about taking divine vengeance against the nations of the world for doing things against Israel they should not have done. All of this is why I'm so adamant about the importance of preparation. Preparation is not about avoiding calamities. It's not about avoiding even tribulation. It's about surviving it. But by definition, all preparation can only be beforehand. Once a calamity strikes, it's too late. One of the interesting features of verse 15 is the statement that the day of YHWH, or rather is near. The day of YHWH is near. The Hebrew word is karov, and it means near in respect to time. or sometimes in distance, that is, as opposed to far away in time and distance. See, here's the thing. Very likely, even though this is the proper and technical definition of the word kero, it is actually used as a kind of Hebrew stereotypical expression to get across the idea of urgency. That is, it's a manner of speaking that says that change, or at least our focused attention, is needed right away, as opposed to God trying to give us a timetable or a location for when and where an event will happen. See, we use typical expressions like this in English when we say, hey, give me a minute. We're not speaking about a duration of time or exactly 60 seconds for use in a timetable. We're saying we have to do something before we leave or some such thing. And so, no, don't worry, it won't take very long. My mother used to say to me, your room's a disaster. You got 30 seconds to get that cleaned up. She didn't mean I have a half a minute of time. That's all I've got to begin and finish cleaning up my room. She meant I was to stop what I was doing right now and go clean my room. Another point I'd like to make. When God says, as you did it, it will be done to you, in many ways sounds like the opposite of what we've been taught from the pulpit about human relationships. That is, we are instructed not to repay evil done to us with evil, but rather with kindness. We are not to retaliate when someone offends us, and so on. However, what this issue of like for like is envisioning here in Obadiah is the long-standing principle of justice that God has ordained, which scholars call lex talionis, or proportional justice. That is, we're not to execute a person for stealing property. If a person steals a goat, they're not required to replace it with a bull. But it has another side to it. If someone murders another, they must give up their own life. So God's justice for Edom and for the nations is that the manners in which they harmed and oppressed Israel will be visited back upon them as the same measure of the punishment they deserve. Now, historically speaking, Israel has been destroyed a few times by Gentile nations. Each time, they've eventually come back as a nation. So now God will destroy the nations who participated in destroying them. And while this cycle may repeat, in the end times, it will be the end of these cycles. And these nations will never rise again, or at least in any recognizable form. There is also another aspect of how Edom treated Israel coming back on their own head that is something valuable that I kind of learned the hard way as a younger man. It is that typically a natural consequence of attempting revenge or retribution for an offense against you will backfire in the longer run. And just as typically, doing something intentionally harmful against someone will nearly always result in a negative consequence to the perpetrator. It may not be immediate, but it is close to inevitable. In other words, while in the case of Edom, God's wrath certainly is the catalyst, it doesn't always have to be. Our own unwise, unkind actions can turn right around and eventually bite us in ways we never could have imagined, even though we might get immediate benefit or satisfaction. It seems as though this is just the way the universe operates, and why wouldn't it? YHWH, God the Creator, designed it all, spoke it into existence, and so naturally every process operates in ways that reflects His plan and order. It's inescapable, although from Adam and Eve forward, humanity has believed God's plan and order can be defeated. Even heavenly creatures have tried and failed. So from verse 15 of Obadiah forward, we find a concept presented that is equal in its universal effect to that which I just mentioned about the cosmos and all life, spiritual and biological, how it was planned and ordered. It is. The day of Jehovah is coming. Nothing can delay it. Nothing can defeat it. This intervention into the affairs of humans will affect every level of society, beginning with the military and the political, but also quickly engulfing the leaders of all the world's religions. Amos, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, they all speak about this day. So what we have to grasp is that Edom's fate is not unique and it's not isolated. Rather, our entire planet will be affected because our entire planet, every nation, has become like Edom in God's eyes. Listen to one of the most exciting and terrifying passages in all of the prophets. In Zechariah 14:1, look, a day is coming for Adonai when your plundered Jerusalem will be divided right there within you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for war. The city will be taken. The houses will be rifled. The women will be raped, and half the city will go into exile. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the battle. Be cut off from the city. Then Adonai will go out and fight against those nations. Fighting is on a day of battle. This passage perfectly mirrors what we have been studying in Obadiah. It's the way of humans. That's all of us. To think in relative terms. Relative terms. I've heard, and I suppose admittedly used to think, that in the end times, when this day of the Lord arrives and all the nations are ravaged, the USA will be the lone exception. Like to dispel that. Why do we think this? Well, we think, we may not be perfect, but we must be better and more good-minded nation than all the others. So God will spare us. Well, I've realized that this is a false conception. Some of this false conception was because until merely 20 years ago, perhaps, we thought of ourselves as a fundamentally and majority Christian nation devoted to God. The truth is that even though our founding fathers believed strongly in God, the Bible, and the Ten Commandments, many were deists and little more. Still, we think, well, that's better than nothing, or believing in a false God. And then we think that institutional Christianity is the faith that Yeshua taught, so if we adhere to that, we are relatively better than those who don't. But when we open up recorded church history, we find that the church as we know it actually began in the 4th century at the urging of Constantine and in Rome, not in the Holy Land. And it disavowed the Jewish people, Israel, and it disavowed the very Bible that Yeshua and all the apostles used and taught from. But we think, well, even if that's true, it's better than following Islam or Hinduism or any other religion, because at least there's a nugget of truth at its core that Jesus is Savior. If I take $5 from my mom's purse, but you steal an iPhone, I'm still a better person than you. Because even though both things are stealing an iPhone's far worse. And if much of the world supports Hamas and the Palestinians against Israel, but I support the Palestinians and Israel, well, I'm a much better person. And God will accept it more because although I'm not supposed to support Israel's enemies, at least I also support Israel. You hear this thinking? Relative. But the Bible couldn't be more clear. This is simply not how God sees things. Nor is it taught that way in the Holy Scriptures. And this is why a lot of nations and politicians and religious leaders and laymen and just regular secular folks are going to be shocked and surprised when the day of YHWH arrives. Let's remove any such naive notions from our minds. All nations are going to suffer God's wrath. And therefore, every nation's citizens will as well. And it will not just be on a humanly calculated relative basis. It is written, so it will be, whether we think it's fair or just or not. Now, might you be thinking that what I'm saying is a bit overboard? Let's read Obadiah verse 16. For just as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so will all the nations drink in turn. Yes, they'll drink and gulp it down and be as if they had never existed. If that isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. The first word of this verse should not be overlooked. In Hebrew, the word is key. It's a word that could be called a connecting word. In this case, it connects verse 16 to verse 15. That is, because of verse 15, then verse 16 is going to happen. However, that leaves a fundamental question for this verse. Who's the you that have drunk of God's holy mountain? Is it Edom? Is it the nations? Is it the Israelites? This has been a subject of debate for a very long time, but that debate is more centered on Christian fundamentalism than on real Bible exegesis. That is, more on traditional church doctrine than on what the Bible actually says. What the Bible says takes some previous understanding about what God's doing and why, and so it explains his speech. Basically, it's this. Some of the previous days of the Lord were God's wrath upon his own people, Israel, for their unfaithfulness and rebellion. But in the end, God's wrath will be upon all the nations in order to preserve and protect Israel. Thus, the you in the opening phrase is Israel. And what Israel has drunk is God's furious wrath. But now, so will all the nations. Okay? We'll continue in Obadiah next week.
For more teachings of real Bible study and to rediscover God's Word with Tom Bradford, visit Torah Class today on the web, streaming TV, or download the Torah Class mobile app.